Listen, I was talking to an AD, who asked me not to, to sort of keep it to myself here, keep him to himself.
It's just us girls. No one's listening. It's fine.
But I was talking to somebody on the side of 8, and he basically said, listen, we're going to 9. At some point, we are going to 9.
Welcome to Fringe Element here on the 440 Sports Network. My name is Braden Gall, and you can follow me on Twitter at Braden Gall.
Mine's Erin Dugan. You can follow me on Twitter at the Erin Dugan or Instagram Erin_Dugan.
And we have a guest today on the show, live from Destin, Florida, the Emerald Coast, Ralph Russo, longtime reporter for the AP. Ralph, introduce yourself to all the great people out there.
Hello, Braden, and hello, Erin. Nice to meet you all. Yeah, working for the AP for 25 years, national college football writer. You can find me at Ralph D. Russo AP. It's been an interesting few days here in Destin. One of the great parts about my job is get to travel all over the country and to some very beautiful places like the Gulf Coast of Florida, though you spend a lot of your time at beautiful places in hotel lobbies. Yeah, there is a beach. I'm almost positive there's a beach here. I've glanced at it from afar, but mostly I've been stuck in a hotel lobby trying to run people down.
Well, we'll try to get your sense of what actually happened this week in Destin, which we're not really sure how much actually happened, but there might be some things that we can discuss. Certainly we'll get into the remnants of the Fisher Saban feud after Greg Sankey poured a giant bucket of cold water, I'm assuming behind closed doors, on all of these coaches and told them to stay in line. And then we'll talk about the AP poll, of course, which you and I have talked about before. But the AP poll, you guys are in the process of putting together the voters, and that's going to happen obviously later on in the summer. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Before we do any of that, however, Erin Dugan and Ralph, if you'd like to chime in and invent some copy for our sponsor, a wonderful sports bar, Jasper's, here in Nashville, and Four Top Hospitality with 13 locations across the Southeast in Memphis and Huntsville and Jackson, Mississippi, serving all you wonderful SEC fans, you are welcome to. But Erin, our podcast is brought to you by who?
No, we'll let Ralph do it.
Okay.
Ralph, I literally make something up. Often has nothing to do with restaurants or the hospitality industry in general.
Well, I lived in Jackson for a while, so I'm trying to remember what if I've maybe ever been to this place in Jackson. But listen, everywhere you go, you need a good sports bar, right? Because it's the place to find friends in unfamiliar territory. I'm in a new place. I really don't know this place. I really don't know anybody. But if I go to the sports bar, I will find somebody rooting for or against my team who I could either become friends with or enemies with, and that's sports bars bringing the world together.
Jasper's creating enemies on West End for 1.5 years.
That was very impressive.
Well done, Ralph. Well done. And again, honestly, Four Top Hospitality, who owns Jasper's in Nashville, they have awesome locations, Char, etc., Saltine, Etch, Amerigo, all across the Southeast, again, in 13 locations. So obviously all you SEC fans, make sure you check them out. They are wonderful and amazing people, a small, locally owned sort of company that does really great work, great chefs, and the next evolution of the sports bar that, of course, will bring people together. All right. So first question for you, Ralph. What do we actually know happened? I know there's no divisions. Maybe there is. We know that the pod system is probably dead, and we know that Texas and Oklahoma have been heavily involved in the scheduling discussions. What else? What actually happened this week in Destin in your mind?
Okay, let me roll some things back. I don't know heavily involved is the right word for Texas and Oklahoma, but they have been involved. And the only reason that might be semantics, but the only reason why I would correct that is, they really aren't here. They're not here. They're at the Big 12 meetings, awkward, in Dallas this week. They are truly, teams without countries. So, but they absolutely have been involved and advised. As far as the divisions, so I guess Greg Sankey last night, we're recording this on Thursday morning, and Wednesday he spoke with us, and he basically said, listen, we're probably not getting this done this week. Not the division. The divisions are going away. The schedule piece of it, where it's going to be 8 or 9, probably not going to get done this week. They're probably going to kick the can down the road. He left the door open about an inch to the fact that, hey, the presidents are coming in today. Maybe after we present something to them, we'll have them vote, because ultimately the president's got to rubber stamp this. but again, it seems unlikely. And the feedback I'm getting from other ADs off the record and on background is, that doesn't seem likely. Sounds like what this problem is essentially is they don't have enough votes to get this thing decided. It's got to be a majority vote as far as 8 or 9 conference games. And it sounds like they're close enough to 50-50 where they don't want to do that. So it doesn't look like that's getting done this week. They're tinkering with some transfer rules in the conference that would make it give players a little more time, football players a little more time to transfer within the conference to match up with the NCAA windows. I think their thought is, well, why are we telling our own kids they can't transfer within the conference after February 1st? Those are the best players. Why are we shutting them off to our schools and sending them to other conferences? So it doesn't look like they're going to get a ton done this week. Hence the soap opera between Nick and Jimbo ends up dominating the headlines.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things that everybody's going to latch onto just because of the nature of it. But if we dig in, Ralph, Braden and I talked a little bit about this yesterday, just digging into all the reasons why teams would lean towards 8 versus 9. And we came up with several, but just throwing them out there and tell us what we're leaving out or what the most important ones of these are that we're naming. Obviously, like some teams, like getting them to bowl eligibility if they're in the lower half of the SEC is a factor. I'm sure strength of schedule for college football playoff contention is a factor, but so is ticket sales, which is money. So is TV, which is money. And we can keep going. But what are the most important factors and what are we leaving out?
I don't know if you're leaving much out there, but you're right. I mean, the schedules have 2 main components, right? There's the competitive component and the financial component. And I think that you end up having to sort of balance, which one is more important. And of course, competitiveness has a financial component embedded in it, because if you're good, you're going to sell more tickets. And if you are constantly, if you're adding another loss and you're playing and you're not playing for a bowl game, it draws attention away from the fans. I don't think there's a TV component to this because that's come up a little bit. The television contract is set. And if you think about it, adding another conference game doesn't necessarily give more inventory, because what you'd be taking away from the non-conference schedules, for the most part, is a game that's going to be an SEC non-conference home game, right?
It's a good point.
Most of the schools are not going to punt their good non-conference game where they may be at a neutral site or playing at another opponent's home and home.
Right.
Mostly what they're going to punt on is, that other bye game against an FCS team or a lower level FBS team. So I don't think, now maybe in the long run, if you're playing 9 conference games, your TV partner comes back to you and says, okay, like we like the way this looks and, we can possibly bump up a little bit, but I don't think it's affecting that part of the TV schedule. But there's a whole bunch of other, as you said, financial components as far as ticket sales and everything that goes into competitiveness and being a little more competitive.
Well, when you make that point, sorry, Braden, when you make that point about, you're right, the inventory is not changing. And in fact, if we're talking about SEC specifically, the actual good product that you get for your own network, SEC network 2 and plus, like all of those different components actually could be better with those conference rivalries. So I hear you. And you're not wrong.
But does this? Here's a question though: doesn't Texas and Oklahoma change all of this? Like, or like the new deal that they stole from CBS that doesn't have Texas and Oklahoma baked into it, does it? I mean, or was it one of those like wink, wink, nod, nod? Maybe we're going to get Texas and Oklahoma.
I don't know if there's any record of that. I'm not sure if anybody said that in a place where it could be FOIA'd, but as of right now, as far as we know, there isn't necessarily a bump for Texas and Oklahoma in this television content. Now, could be wrong, and that may be something baked in that we haven't heard from ESPN. Again, they've been very coy about, hey, when we expand, because even now, even though we know they're expanding, there's still this element of like, well, they're not here, so they're really not part of us yet. Because even when the scheduling stuff came up, right? I mean, we're still, yes, we've included them in the conversations, but we've advised them, we've updated and briefed them, we've gotten some feedback, but they've been very cautious about trying to about overstepping their bounds, because contractually,
right, Texas
and Oklahoma are still in another conference, and they're trying really hard not to get sued. So there is that gray area that Texas and Oklahoma and the SEC are working in right now.
I guess I was under the assumption that all of this stuff is probably going to kick in around the same time. The new scheduling model, playoff expansion, yes. Texas and Oklahoma. And I'm assuming that opens the door for a renegotiation of the television contract, even though it's fairly new. Mm-hmm. I assume that was sort of always the plan, which is why, to me, 9 conference games is significant more inventory to sell back to ESPN. And frankly, it allows you the 3 and 6 model. This goes back to Erin's first question. Like we sort of know Vanderbilt, Missouri, South Carolina, the teams that don't always get to bowl games, they're going to want 8 conference games. It's obvious. Kentucky, although Kentucky's been good, we know the big boys are going to want more. Saban and Smart have been open about it. At some point, doesn't the money and the fan love of the extra SEC game and the ticket sales and getting rid of that FCS game, doesn't that all eventually push this to 9 games? Or is that...
So I think so. Listen, I was talking to an AD, who asked me not to, to sort of keep it to myself here, keep him to himself.
It's just us girls. No one's listening. It's fine.
But I was talking to somebody on the side of 8, and he basically said, listen, we're going to 9. At some point, we are going to 9. I realize, and I've also made peace with it because I understand the benefits I get from 9. I would prefer 8 for some of the reasons that you're talking about. Competitively, it works a little better for our program, but I also see the benefits of 9. The folks, my suspicion is, from talking to some folks here, is that they all the folks who sort of are in the 8 camp understand that, well, if it does go to 9, here's the way I benefit. I will get to see these teams coming through my backyard more often. I will get more Texas and Oklahoma. The fancy new toy will come to my building. I can build better home schedules for my fans. So I think there's a recognition, even from those who would rather stay at 8, or at least from some of those who rather stay at 8, that 9 has some benefits too. I also think, without getting into, again, too many, naming names, because I think some folks are trying to be guarded about this. It's been interesting to hear while still having a hard time confirming that, I talked about the one AD who was like, yeah, I prefer 8, but I see the benefits in 9. I also think that there are some who have generally preferred 9 in the past, who now see the complications with it. Look at their non-conference schedules that have been mapped out over the next 10 years and say, boy, we added this really good school. We added this really good school. I mean, listen, Greg Byrne talked about this yesterday, the Alabama AD. So he talked about this on the record. Saban has always been a proponent of 9. So you'd assume that Alabama is a proponent of 9, but then you hear Greg Byrne talking about we scheduled our non-conference schedule with the idea that we were going to have 8, and we have some big opponents coming up. And now, do I want to keep the 2 big opponents plus 9 conference games? And now I'm playing 11 Power 5 teams in some seasons. That might not be the thing I really want. So I think, again, there are some who prefer 9, who I think understand the complications of doing that and maybe are a little more reluctant. And I think there are some who prefer 8, but also in the long run know, listen, it's probably going to 9. And by the way, I can make that work.
Right.
Yeah. And this is just, before, I know we were kind of dwelling on this, but it's interesting. And when we're talking about, that we're inevitably heading in that direction, just a random point is my background's in television and some SEC network stuff. And all of those schools are completely broadcast capable. So you no longer have to send out a TV truck to a non-conference opponent where the quality of the programming is not going to be as good. It's a lot more expensive because these schools are already completely equipped, and we're doing it alone in 2020 and 2021. So I don't know. That's just one more thing that probably is pointing us in that direction.
Yeah, I just think that I think it goes back to sort of what Braden was talking about. Simple logic. You don't bring these two massive teams into your conference, right? Texas and Oklahoma, and then limit your exposure,
Correct.
your conference's exposure to them,
and then not play them.
Yeah, it doesn't. And I understand you're getting rid of the divisions no matter what. They have established that the divisions are gone. So even if you stick with 8, the 1-7. You're going to rotate those 7 more frequently, so they will come through a little more frequently. But adding that extra game, I think, just makes a lot of sense. Now, of course, listen, you mentioned the playoff and the bigger picture, and I think there is some, again, legit concern among SEC coaches, especially. I'm not sure if the coach is going to have a whole lot of say in this stuff. I think ultimately the ADs are going to make this call, and the presidents. I think the coaches, it's like, oh, so what do you guys think? That's great.
It's a ceremonial. It's a ceremonial vote for sure.
Yeah. So, but I do think that there is, even at the AD level, some legit concern of like, wait a second. Okay, we're going to play 9. The Big Ten is going to play 9. The ACC is still playing 8. The Pac-12, they would actually prefer to get back to 8. Though this whole alliance thing isn't really working out like we thought it was going to. So I don't know if we're going to have enough non-conference games available to fill out our schedule. So does that really work? I still think ultimately the Pac-12 might slide back to 8. And in other words, long story short, it's we're playing 9. We're in the toughest conference, the SEC. Like, why are we making it harder on ourselves to get to the playoff, especially if we're not 100% sure it's going to 12? But no, but that's the thing. If we're not 100% sure it's going to 12, and we still don't know that, like now we're going to be piling some extra losses on ourselves. Are we going to be eliminating ourselves from possible playoff spots if it only goes to 8 or if it stays at 4? So I get that as well.
Are you genuinely concerned about the SEC being left out of the playoff, Ralph? Honestly, like deep in your heart, are you worried about that?
No, but I think what you end up being worried about is not necessarily the SEC being left out. It's how many of the SEC teams are left out. In other words, if it's 4, if we're going to stay at 4, and I don't think that's likely. But that's the problem. See, the problem is this uncertainty. Like I can say, well, it's going to get to 12. Don't worry, guys. It's going to get to 12. But it's not. Like we don't know that for sure. It's not at 12. We don't have a done deal on that. So the uncertainty of where the playoff is heading, is it going to be 12? Is it going to stay at 4? Is it going to be 8? I think creates just enough discomfort that when they look around and say, what should we do here?
I think a 2-loss team, though, once you go to 8 even or 10, whatever the number is, two-loss teams are getting in. Like we could have a 2-loss team this year get into the 4-team playoff. I will say this, which I think is ironic about this entire conversation, is right now we don't have a playoff in 2027.
Right. There is nothing.
There is no playoff right now. Right. All right. So anything else from before we get to Fisher and Saban, which we're going to have our conversation about? Is there anything else? I mean, other than like, did you get any sense of which rivalries they want to protect? Like, for example, I don't think anyone under the age of 40 gives a shit about Tennessee and Alabama. I think everyone over the age of 40 loves that game. I grew up on Florida and Tennessee being a key rivalry. Obviously the Egg Bowl and the Iron Bowl, and there's some, but like I get in big arguments with like Booger McFarland about like LSU and Florida is not that important to LSU people, whereas like the Magnolia Bowl is. Like, do you get any sense as to what games are going to be protected by talking to anybody, or is that like too far down the road?
It is too far down the road. I will say this, and it brings up a point when at the beginning of our podcast, Home and Home, we talked about this on my show. I think you're too far down the road to get into the minutia of like, okay, who do you want? Greg Sankey was asked about this. Like, how much input will the schools have on who their permanent opponents will be? And he basically gave a "we'll see," which is clearly like this is being talked about. Now you can say of course, like I think it's being talked about like informally, but I think before they even have made the 8 or 9 call, I don't know if they can really get deep into the weeds about it. But the one thing I will say is I do think there is an acknowledgement that we have to balance some tradition oh, these are cool rivalries with like, hey man, the competitive part of it. Like how much can you burden a really good school, a team that fancies itself as a national title contender. Yeah. But do you want to have 3 monster rivalries every year? And on the flip side, hey, is there a way we can, if we're going to go to 9, make it a little easier for the schools that aren't necessarily competing for a national championship? And with that in mind, hey, I understand this is your traditional rival, but maybe you'd rather play Vandy. Sorry, Vandy.
No. And I think it's the most fun exercise that I'm doing right now. I'm just like playing around with it all day, every day, just like looking at who it is. And I'm okay with there being a little imbalance, like Vanderbilt and Kentucky and, South Carolina, Missouri getting slightly easier sets of 3, let's say, than Alabama or LSU or Georgia. And because guess what? If you look at Auburn's schedule, it's going to get easier because they right now, if even if their big 3 is tough, and let's say it's Alabama, Georgia, and LSU, let's say, hypothetically, which is a monstrous 3 games to have on your schedule each week. They don't play Vanderbilt twice every 4 years, but they're going to get Vanderbilt twice every 4 years. So it's actually easier than it is today. And if you give Vandy an easy schedule in their permanent 3, well, that's actually going to be tougher because then they're going to have Bama and A&M and Texas and Oklahoma every 2 years. So it is actually going to even out no matter who your permanents are.
Generally, 2 points. Generally speaking, the East is going to get a little tougher. The East schedules are going to get a little tougher. Very broadly speaking, the East schedules are going to get a little tougher. The West schedule is going to get a little easier.
Bingo.
Very, very broadly. I'm painting broad brush there. I want to sit on Kentucky just for 1 second here because I was interested. If you think about a program like Kentucky, which has had this breakthrough, right? They have become something that they've had a hard time being. Over the last couple, they've had a couple of 10-win seasons. Like, what would that look like if they didn't have the benefit of a schedule that is a little more manageable? And I think if you're Kentucky, you're guarding the ability to your program to blossom, your program to grow. They've taken advantage of Florida being a little less than Florida, Tennessee being kind of a mess. They've taken advantage of the fact that their permanent crossover rival is Mississippi State, which is generally, a program they can see eye to eye with. And then they've also taken advantage because it's only an 8-game schedule of, you know what? We don't really need to stretch ourselves too much on these 3 other games. We know we're going to play Louisville at the end. So but there are other programs in other conferences that look at that and what comes to mind is like Rutgers or Maryland in the Big Ten, where they have a hard time growing their program because they're constantly butting into, we got to pay Penn State, Michigan State, Ohio State, Michigan every damn year, right? So I understand why when you think of it, looking through the prism of Kentucky and understand the growth of that program and how much the schedule helped the growth of that program, I think you understand why there's some protectionism when it comes to the 8 games.
So let's get to Fisher and Saban. And I guess my first question is, I thought there was a lot of performative faux outrage from Fisher, even in the moment. I don't think it's inauthentic. I think it's who he is. How big was the bucket of cold water? How tight was the leash that Greg Sankey jerked? Because, Lane Kiffin doesn't do an interview on the Dan Patrick Show because he was going to be asked about it and he wasn't allowed to. How it sounds like Sankey had a come to Jesus meeting with all these boys.
Well, so what Greg will tell you, or what he told us, is I didn't have to do that. We sort of established that before we got here. But he did say this. And I think, sometimes what they say, I think we love to, in our business, sort of say sources said this, sources said that. But a lot of times they tell you a lot if you're listening closely enough on the record. And after Greg said, listen, I think we had sort of made our point before we even got here. He said in his very scholarly Greg Sankey way, and I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't remember the exact quote. We did emphasize to our coaches that as leaders, they should talk about their teams and their players and their programs. Right?
It sounds like how I talk to my 5-year-old.
Right. There was at least a mention of stay out of each other's businesses.
Yeah.
And I want to also reference something here because, again, I'm old enough. I think you guys are maybe old enough to remember this. But when Mike Slive took over as conference commissioner, one of the problems the SEC had is the SEC was just all up in each other's businesses.
We talked about this last week.
Okay, yeah. And I think that Greg wants to reestablish a little of that culture.
Yeah, he's like
rising. We gotta get out of each other's business.
Rising tide raises all ships kind of vibes. He's like, let's cut it out and just, be on the same team.
Yeah, we can't be. I mean, back then it was more about like people literally ratting on each other.
Yeah.
Like, hey, go investigate that. And there was a tinge of that in what Fisher was saying. So I think there is a little bit of like, hey, stay out of each other's businesses and let's not be the ones ratting on each other.
It's the subpoena for Phil Fulmer on a teleconference, and which is like, but again, as a fan of the game and in the member of the media, like I want more of it. Give it all to me. But it does remind me, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of NFL football players and NBA players where they're all best friends now. And like, if we all just get along and stop all the other stuff, like the NFL gets more popular or the NBA gets more popular. So it does remind me a little bit of that in
Ralph,
terms of.
Go ahead. Braden. Did this surprise you? Because I have to say Braden and I know it's just, a media uproar and it's interesting. And like Braden said, like, we're like, it's fun, whatever. But working in like my background's in videos and broadcast. So I'm used to hearing coaches mic'd up after during games. I've heard all of it. Y'all have heard a lot. So does that make it slightly less surprising? Because Kirby Smart alluded to this. He's like, that's nothing. If you had really heard what we heard, this would sound, what did he say? It would sound like Disney.
Mickey Mouse. Yeah.
It sounded like Mickey Mouse.
Yeah.
Did you have a similar sentiment? Because it just did not shock me that much. Now, was it the wrong thing for Nick Saban to do? For sure. But I have to say I've heard a lot worse.
No, so I was shocked, and here's why. Because you're right. You can say I've heard worse, and I've had off the record conversations with coaches where they will like, "Hey, man, I hate that dude."
Right, but it wasn't public.
But the fact, so it's in them, but there is an enormous wall between the public and the private conversations, and to see some of that spill out into public. Because they are so guarded. And that's what I guess my point, like it was shocking because of what you said. They are so guarded. They are so conditioned to not go there publicly.
Yeah.
For a coach to go there publicly against the most accomplished coach in the history of the sport, a person who is essentially Nick Saban is college football to much of this country. Like he is the embodiment of college football to many sports fans. So for Jimbo Fisher to sort of go after him was, I think it was, I found it to be almost stunning. I'm watching that news conference, via YouTube, like a lot of us did, watching the stream of it in my apartment in Brooklyn. And every minute or so, he comes with another bomb, and I'm just like, oh.
It was so. It's never been. It's not personal when you're yelling at someone during a game.
Yeah,
like it's not about their personal. This was personal, and it raises a question.
The platform.
Yeah, and it raises I think it's the greatest press conference. I think it passed Mike Gundy, and I think it passed Dan Hawkins. I think it's the greatest press conference that I've ever covered or been around in my time. Do you think they actually like each other? Don't like each other? Is there a real genuine animus there? Because it used to be that everyone thought Jimbo was like his prized oldest son pupil or whatever. Now it feels like they genuinely don't like each other.
Yeah, I don't think they were ever super close. I think that may have been something more of a media tale. I don't know. I mean, I don't think they're like buddies in the way, or again, as close as like Kirby and Nick are. So I don't know if there is a fractured relationship that was once very like, we talk on the phone every week and now, no, we're not talking anymore. I think that there was probably a little bit of a I think that may have been overblown, right? So I don't think we've got a relationship that was this and is now completely shattered. It was probably more of like, hey, man, like, oh, yeah, we work together and you're fine. We're fine with each other. And now there's probably less of that. Jimbo basically, here's what I'll say. I think both coaches were being strategic when it first started, right? I think Nick was trying to get a message across to his donors about, hey, man, like, this is the game now. We need to step up here at Alabama. But I also think he realized he was in the wrong. He should not have called out Texas A&M. He should not have called out Miami or Jackson State for that matter. So I do think that there's an acknowledgement from Nick that, yeah, he probably stepped into a place where he shouldn't have. I think from Jimbo, I think he was legitimately pissed, if I'm allowed to say that here. I also think that what he has done with this stuff, defending his program, in some way has bought him more credibility and more goodwill with his fan base than anything he has done on the field, other than maybe beating Alabama. I mean, like, the record hasn't been so stunning that but nonetheless, the Aggies are really rallying around Jimbo. So I think Ross Bjork has said this, it galvanized our fan base. It galvanized our team. Well, I mean, then that was calculated too. But I also, when he showed up here yesterday, I think it was yesterday, the days are bleeding into each other. And Jimbo talked personally and said, we're moving on. We're moving on. We're moving on. He didn't want to have anything more of it. I think it was also acknowledgement from Jimbo. Like, listen, I've done what I can here. I got my message across. I don't really need to belabor this.
Yep.
Like, we can move on because, like, I mission accomplished. Let's go to the next thing.
Then Scott Woodward just really put a nice bow on the whole thing by talking about them being two hillbillies fighting from West Virginia. It's a no-win situation. Feinbaum died.
What did he say? Like,
he said, I'm not going to get in between two hillbillies fighting from West Virginia. That's a no-win situation.
That's so good.
Yeah.
And then he backpedaled, but like, it's a great line. It's a great line.
This is the thing. Like, Scott doesn't talk on the record that much. So I think he had, maybe it was one of those deals again, like he probably had said that in private, thought it was a funny line, and then decided, yeah, sure, I'm gonna do this in front of people here, and then realized, maybe that was.
Then West Virginia is like,
he was workshopping
what did we
material.
Do?
Yes,
yeah, totally. It was a bit, yeah.
By the way, go to Jasper's. Just going to throw this in here randomly at the end of the pod. Make sure you go to Jasper's and Four Top Hospitality all across the Southeast, and of course Ralph joining us live from Destin here. And I want to get to the AP poll. We only have a couple minutes left, but I want to get to the AP poll in just a minute. But when you look at like what Saban's real true goal is, because I agree with you can't use specific words. We've already beaten this horse basically on every show that we've done. Is it now becoming a public PR strategy to try to shift public thinking? Like, because really they kind of agree with each other. And we've said this now for 2 weeks. Like, everyone is agreeing that they all need some uniform, whatever you want to call it, but no one can actually present any ideas. I'm assuming there was a lot of NIL talk down there and no new ideas because no one has any answers to this, right?
Well, it's not necessarily no new ideas. It's what is the path to implementing those ideas? And this is the one thing I'll try to be quick on this. I asked Greg Sankey, like, I understand the NCAA has sort of been half sidelined here and we're waiting for congressional intervention possibly, but can the SEC do something legally to regulate NIL within the SEC? The idea it's a smaller group, so maybe there's less antitrust exposure. And basically what he said is like, we don't really know that yet. Like we have our lawyers on the case, but we're not sure if we can provide the oversight and policies that would stand a legal challenge.
Okay. I just think Nick's on his PR soapbox trying to get public opinion to change. So we'll see.
Well,
we'll see.
He's definitely using his soapbox in a certain way. Are we still going AP poll?
Yeah, man.
I have a couple questions. Okay.
Sure,
this is a larger, maybe a little bit more vague, but you're involved with you've been around for a long time. You're very respected in, the industry.
Go on. Word you're looking for. Yeah. Very old.
What'd you
Very old.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I'll get to the point. Old. And then the AP poll, obviously, as well as like the college football playoff in general, there's a lot of facts involved, but there's also a lot of subjectivity. And Braden and I were talking a little bit about groupthink yesterday. Braden brought that up. And then I'm just wondering how you kind of combat like the confusion between causality versus correlation and how those kind of like, how you differentiate between the two.
So I don't know if I'm going to have a good answer here. So I'm going to go to a stock answer because maybe this hits. One of the things that we try to do with the AP poll is we don't give voters very much of any strict guidelines. It's a little bit, and frankly, like the college football playoff, like they started, like, we're just looking for the 4 best teams. We just, hey, rank the teams as you think, as you see fit. The best teams in the country. And I think I know people cringe at that because, it's so subjective. But what you want is to sort of avoid some of the groupthink, and you want to encourage people to think, okay, like, we don't want you to just check a box here and say, okay, this team checks 5 boxes, so they go here. This team checks 4 boxes, so they're next. And I think by allowing the voters to sort of meld some of their own criteria, basically we tell them, like, ultimately it's play the results, right?
Right.
Watch what happens on the field and react to those results and incorporate that into your ballot. And that's kind of it. At that point,
that makes sense to me.
Because I do think the more you try to layer criteria on how you should vote, the more you're likely to sort of, I think foster some of the groupthink. And then all of a sudden you find yourself thinking, like, why are we even doing this poll? Why don't we just have a formula?
So what you're saying is that people meet you with, it's so subjective, it's not concrete enough. But what you're saying is by taking away some of this, you're creating bias when you're taking away some sort of subjectivity, because then you do create the same groupthink model.
I think so. And listen,
I think that's right.
We know we're not. I am not blind to the idea that we are not perfect. This is not a perfect ranking system and it's not supposed to be. I think that what we understand, or I understand from being around it so much, is the biggest thing is the difference between team 5 and team 11. While people may look at that and go, oh, how can that be? Like, there is probably just one game, a couple of points here and there.
It might be one play.
Well, and maybe even one bad subjective call.
Yep.
Yeah. So you've,
right.
Yeah.
Well, Ralph, thank you so much, man. Obviously, you can get to him on the Twitter at Ralph D. Russo, right? Is that correct? Did I have
Ralph D. Russo
That's
AP?
Right.
Ralph
and
D. Russo AP.
And technically, we're still in first place, but it's only June, so our hearts soon to be ripped out of our chests as Mets fans. It's just how it is. We got college baseball
I think they actually
here.
Might be good, Braden.
Don't say that, dude. That's what
I hate to even say it. I think they actually might be pretty good.
Famous last words. Ralph, thank you so much. Make sure you're following Erin on the Twitters at the Erin Dugan, at Erin_Dugan on Instagram. You can get to me, of course, at Braden Gall. Full 40 Sports on the YouTube page. Make sure you check all that stuff out as well. And of course, our wonderful sponsor, Jasper's in Nashville, as well as all the other great 4 Top hospitality locations across the Southeast. Maybe we'll get Mike Leach and Lane Kiffin yelling at each other next week. One can dream. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ralph. And thank you guys all for listening. Rate, review, subscribe, all that great stuff. This has been Fringe Element here on the 440 Sports Network.